So I plotted Uber. So try to go back in time to before Uber existed. So past solutions were a horse. Current solutions, taxi or car service. And there's a new solution called Uber. And it was actually called Uber Cab when it was released. And I would argue that at that time, users' expectations were extremely low. And that Uber was actually significantly better than was out there. I mean, think about it. You don't have to hail a cab. You don't have to stand in the rain. You don't have to fight to get in the cab. You don't get in the cab and then feel like you're literally a prisoner in handcuffs because there's the bulletproof glass window. You know, the seat is plastic. And then when you get to where you need to, you don't have to worry about haggling over a tip or being delayed by payment. You just get out of the car. So I would argue I was actually significantly better. But now still assume that you're Uber. You're the PM at Uber. And V1's out there. And you got to figure out what's released next. What are your options? Uber Lux, Uber X, Uber Pool. Now, I didn't work at Uber. I don't know how they looked at this. I don't know what they chose, but this is how I would have applied this situation to the framework. I would argue that Uber Lux is slightly a different segment, right? Because it's more premier, somebody who wants to pay a bunch more money. Uber X and Pool is somebody who actually wants to save a lot of money. There's slightly different use cases in that Pool is there's going to be more people in the car, whereas X, it might only be you in the car, but it's still somebody who wants to get somewhere very cheaply. So I'm curious, did anybody here work at Uber or have any significant others who worked at Uber and has some insight onto where this might have actually been plotted? No? Does anybody else think that they would have plotted this differently?
No, I agree. I mean, I've used Uber Lux, and you can simply get an exact same car in Uber X. You know, why did I pay 3X?
Yeah.
The same thing.
So is the idea that if it gets further in the X, it's more innovative as well? So I would argue that Uber Pool is probably pretty innovative.
I think that might be a symptom of the solution, but I don't think it's a requirement that it's more innovative. I mean, look, most things that are going to be 10x better than a current solution are probably going to be innovative, right? But it doesn't necessarily have to be. Like, you could compete on quality. It could be something that's existing, but you just drastically increase the quality, and therefore it could be 10x better. So a few notes on using the trade-off map. Number one, it's a guide, not a commandment. Number two, I think it really helps you focus on making something that people want and will use. It does not address any engineering or data risks or anything else, so it's limited in that situation. And also, you cannot believe your own X. You cannot believe your own idea of how much better your product is than somebody else. You need to go find 5 friends who will call you out on your BS and tell you where your product actually sits on that axis. And lastly, I think it works pretty well for trade-off decisions. So the difference between a trade-off decision and maybe one that's not, which we'll talk about in a minute, is that trade-off decision, you're probably working with the same set of users. Whereas if it's a pivot decision, you're probably working with a different set of users. Any questions before we go to story 2? Yes.
I mean, I'll just be a little devil's advocate here, but
that makes it fun.
The Uber example, like obviously Uber X is far and away their most successful product right now.
Yeah.
But like if you looked at it on that matrix, it didn't look like it would necessarily be super attractive. But I guess I'd say like the big innovation was like V1 Uber was they got black car drivers to you who weren't being utilized, and it was only black car drivers, and it was pretty expensive. And
Yeah.
V2 was actually pretty innovative in that, you know, they got drivers who were just ordinary people to drive the car, and they brought the price down a lot. So it went from being twice as expensive as a cab to less expensive than a cab.
Yeah, for sure. The other thing too is like when I create that, like I don't know how many different products they were thinking about that at the time. Like you open up your app now, I think there's 6 or 7, right? And there's actually a few that have changed. So I don't know what they were thinking at the time and what else you would have plotted on there. Because the other thing you could look at it too is you could plot that and you could make it a standalone or you could make it relative to your choices too. All right, story 2. Mouse tails. You know, in my entire life, I still think the most fun I ever had in terms of answering the question of what do you do was I tattoo mice. I got to do that for like 3 or 4 years, and it was actually a blast. But there's about 100 million mice that are used in preclinical research annually. About half of those mice are genetically modified. All genetically modified mice have to be identified, and all mice that were used to breed that genetically modified mouse also have to be uniquely identified. So it's a bigger market than you would probably think. And for us, we realized, and we sort of got pulled into the market, but we realized that all we had to do was provide researchers with the ability to identify and track their mice in a reliable and a simple manner. And so that's what we did. As an enterprise company, hardware, and we were optimizing for revenue. And if you're curious about how to tattoo a mouse tail in 20 seconds or less, you put them in this wonderful little restraint. Can anybody guess why it's red? They can't see red light, so for them it's dark inside, and dark makes it comfortable for them. You insert a little disposable ink slide. It was a razor blade business model, so that little ink slide there was the blade of our model. You put them into a little machine, which we internally nicknamed the Easy Bake Oven, because it kind of looks like that. But inside of the machine is a robotic arm that moves X, Y, Z, and theta over the curvature of the tail. It applies the tattoo, and it comes out, and you have a tattoo on the tail of your mouse. This font was actually extremely difficult for us to come up with. And for the designers in the room or anybody else who loves typeface, so much so that we almost had to commission our own typeface to make it work. I remember one night with my then, I think, girlfriend, I got to choose what we watched on Netflix, and I chose the Helvetica documentary. And as a PSA, if you ever get to choose a movie with your significant other who is not a designer and doesn't really care, or an architect, don't choose the Helvetica documentary. But it was so important for us because the 0, the 8, the D, and the O were extremely similar. And if, for some reason, the needle didn't work at one point, or some of the epidermis flaked off and we didn't get the correct depth, and we realized we were dealing with 1.5 mils of an inch. That's like 1/1000th of an inch was our target zone, or our margin of error for this depth, right? And we could not afford that to happen. So we had to come up. We searched many months to find this typeface that would work for us. Okay, back to the decision. So we had to decide between 3 or 4 characters on the tail. And the reason why was because we looked in all of our market research. There are multiple customer segments. So there's breeders. Those are companies that breed mice and sell them. There's CROs, or contract research organizations, which do outsourced tests for companies. There's big pharma, which we all know. There's big biotech companies. There's medical research universities. And then there's the government, such as the NIH. And everybody that we talked to, and this is where I did my first, probably like 300 user interviews over these years. Everybody said 3 characters was fine, except for one of the breeders. And this one breeder owned 50% of the breeding market, Charles River Laboratories. They said they needed 4. We tried to understand why. We didn't really get a great answer. We asked everybody else. Everybody else says 3. These guys are saying 4. Why? They're like, don't worry about them. They just think that they can do whatever they want because they're the market leader. Okay. Well, we decided to build 3 characters. And to this day, I still regret that decision. And I'll walk through why. Now, thankfully, the company was still successful. It got sold to a PE firm. It's still around today. But ultimately, I think it was the wrong decision. So let's look at this framework. So I created this framework to analyze from really a business or a project success perspective. If you make a decision, what are going to be the impacts of those decisions, and which impacts do you want to avoid? So here, there's 3 different impacts that I looked at. 1 was less time to figure out the product, the market, the distribution. 2 is just a smaller market opportunity overall. And 3 is that it will result in more risk or more resources to be required. And for us, 3-character tattoo resulted in less time and a smaller market. And then a 4-character tattoo resulted in more risk or more resources needed, but that was it. So if we look at this, so the less time is all about you actually have less time to figure it out. It means your timeline's shorter. It means people just have less patience with you. The smaller market could actually mean smaller revenue opportunity, fewer customers, fewer segments to go after. And then more risk or resources. Risk could be anything from legal to IP to data risk. Resources could be people to dollars to whatever you want it to be. But these, I looked at the 3 sort of negative impacts that you would want to avoid when you're making one of these decisions. And in essence, I look at it as you want to be outside of the Venn diagram or outside of the triangle, which would be green. Follow the feedback that you're getting. If it's yellow, take some caution. If it's orange, probably you're in 2, probably ignore. And if it's red, it means that you have less time, a smaller market, and more risk. Why in the world are you listening to your user feedback, even if it's telling you to do this? So in that situation, ignore. Now, why did it look like this for us? Well, Charles River Laboratory was the leader of the breeding market. So when they found out that we were defying them, and we were building three character tattoo instead of 4, they now didn't want to help us out. We didn't get a PO from them on the books. They would badmouth us to the industry. So they're not going to help us at all. And in fact, they might go out of their way to not help us. What it also meant was it wasn't just a smaller market from a revenue perspective. Our story was smaller. Our story to current investors, our story to employees that or folks that we were trying to recruit, our story to other customers was smaller, or to Charles River's customers who buy from Charles River, who sometimes buy pre-identified mice from Charles River. So it wasn't, for us, it wasn't linear. It was actually nonlinear, and we didn't realize that. And because of that, also, our board, for some reason, gave us less time because we were telling them that 3 was going to be easier, and it was, but now we had significantly less time to figure it out and a smaller market. People are willing to give you more time if you have a larger market to go after and a better story to tell, but not when it's shrinking. So there's a few notes on using this triangle. Number 1, guide, not commandment again. 2, this, I think, focuses more on the business or the project success. You don't have to be running a startup to use this. Even if you're in a large company like Indeed or at Experian, you are still a business, or there's still a project that can be successful or not successful. You still have stakeholders. They may not be your board, but they're still stakeholders. You still have to get people on your team. You still have a budget to manage. You still have 2 developers, or maybe you have 10 developers. Right? So I think this can still be applied regardless of the size of the company that you're at. 3, this does address the engineering, data, financing risks that the other framework does not. And there's a 4th thing here. There's actually a flaw in the framework as it's been described, and I'm curious if anybody has spotted the flaw yet. I know there's a few former management consultants in the room, and I would expect them to have found it already. No flaws?
Well, I'm not calling it a flaw, but what does the green represent in this framework?
Green is still, you can, here there is basically, following this decision or making this choice, there is essentially no negative impact, and therefore feel free to follow the feedback that is telling you to take this path. Yes?
It doesn't weigh the relative badness of each of these impacts. I mean, maybe less time is not that big of a deal.
Excellent. It does not at all. It assumes that all 3 impacts are weighted equally, and they're not. So if you were to use this, you need to figure out what do the size of your circles look like, because they're going to be different. And you're probably going to need to get a few people to sanity check you on that so that you're actually weighing them correctly. And lastly, I do think that this works well for trade-off or pivot decisions. And as I mentioned earlier, the difference between the 2 is I think in a trade-off decision, you're typically dealing with the same set of users. In a pivot decision, you're probably looking at 2 different sets of users. Any questions on Framework 2 before we jump to the top 10?